The role played by religious belief in Islamic extremism and terrorism is a topic of recurring debate. We have already explored interesting data in a previous interview with Stefan Hertog, showing, without much surprise, that both personal temperament and circumstances play a part in individuals joining extremist groups. And the specifics of religious beliefs play a big part too, as highlighted by my guest in this episode. Graeme Wood is a journalist who has met ISIS sympathizers and members throughout the world. Graeme is a fluent Arab speaker and has developed a deep understanding of how specific variants of Islam, including Salafism, function as ideologies and recruiting platforms. So I'm thrilled to be here with Graeme Wood. Graeme, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
And so you're a journalist, and you're currently a staff writer at The Atlantic, if I'm correct?
Yes, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Your work has appeared in other publications, so including The New Yorker, The American Scholar, The New Republic, The Wall Street Journal, The International Herald Tribune, and several others. You also lecture in political science at Yale University.
Yes, that's correct. I teach at Yale in spring semesters.
Okay. And so you're perhaps especially known for writing the book The Way of the Strangers, which was published in 2017, and this will be the focus of our conversation. And for those who don't know in the audience, so the subtitle of the book clarifies the topic of the book, which is Encounters with the Islamic State. So first predictable question, what made you want to encounter such people?
Well, I was in Iraq as a reporter in the early 2000s, and so I saw the transformation of the insurgency there, going through many different phases. There were political phases, there were religious phases, and some of these, of course, were overlapping or simultaneous. Mm-hmm. And so when the Islamic State arose, I think I saw it somewhat differently from other people. It was easy to see that there was something new about it, something that was different from Al-Qaeda. And I've always been fascinated by groups that are motivated by systems of belief,
sure.
Not just the predictable elements of self-interest mm-hmm. that we expect everybody to have, but particular beliefs and ways of seeing the world that are different from my own. And the Islamic State certainly qualifies as a group that sees the world differently from how I do.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, judging on the basis of your book, and of course, as you mentioned, you've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, including in countries in which ISIS later, arose. But is it fair to say that based on the content of your book, you encountered, to use this word, people who were more supporters of the Islamic State rather than strictly members of it?
That's correct. I mean, what does it mean to be a member of the Islamic State? There are some people who think the only people who are members of the Islamic State are people who have traveled to be in the Islamic State. Mm-hmm. And then there's others, I think probably more common among actual supporters and members of the Islamic State, who think that you're part of the Islamic State if you have given allegiance. Mm-hmm. The Arabic word for that is bay'ah. And if you've given it, it doesn't matter where you are. You've sworn that you will work on its behalf and that you will be obedient to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And everyone I spoke to either had tried to travel, was going mm-hmm. to try to travel, or wanted to travel and was being thwarted by law enforcement. And I think most of them would either deny or just not answer the question of whether they had given bay'ah to the Islamic State. Mm-hmm. But they all spoke with a voice that was identical to those who had. So it's not clear whether we would just call them supporters or members or what. But I went to great lengths to make sure that their testimony was something that was at least representative of the views of Islamic State supporters.
Sure. And so, I mean, maybe to make it a bit more concrete, we can mention that these people with whom you discussed at length, they were living in various countries quite far from one another, especially Australia is heavily featured, also Egypt, the United States. So it's pretty much all over the place, right?
Yeah, that's right. I haven't done the full country count, but I met in person people in the United Kingdom, in Norway, Australia, the United States. I'm sure I'm missing others, but yeah, there's quite a wide array. And it's funny because when we talked about Al Qaeda maybe 10 years ago, if we said, "Oh, he was a member of Al Qaeda," then we would be effectively saying he was someone who went to Afghanistan and gave allegiance to Osama bin Laden and then came back. And it didn't make any sense to say that someone was in Oslo and was a member of Al Qaeda and yet had never spoken to someone who was in the chain of command of bin Laden. But that's because times have changed, and what was once a quasi-military group is now something that tries to be more like a civilization. And so the connections can be real but non-material.
Yes. So we'll get back to that, I guess. And I suppose before we, get into the more detailed discussion on what these people believe, what drove them to believe this, what sort of teachings they take from these beliefs, maybe we can give a quick, summary of the history of ISIS, maybe some key moments. Just the basic facts on the ground, if that's possible.
Yes, of course. So ISIS, there were many different names that the insurgencies in Iraq took in the 2000s. The Islamic State in Iraq, the Al Qaeda in Iraq, and all of that. The details are actually quite important in that. But for our purposes, we can say Al Qaeda had a number of affiliates, sympathizers. Then at some point in the late 2000s, early 2010s, the United States really disengaged. In general, the coalition that had occupied Iraq decided to hand it over, and there was not to Iraqis, to a mostly Shia government in Baghdad. And during that time, those groups, which had been resoundingly defeated just a few years before by Sunni tribes and by the coalition, started to come back into power. So they started to really lick their wounds, get stronger in Syria. They took over the city of Raqqa. And by 2014, they were strong enough that they were threatening very large parts of Western Iraq and northern Iraq, and specifically the city of Mosul, which was sacked in May of 2014. During all that time, though, what they had been telling sort of quietly, I mean, the word was getting out that if you wanted to go join Al Qaeda, it was no longer invariably fatal to do so. You could go from London or from Paris and then travel to Syria, and you could take part in a kind of state building process, especially in Syria and Raqqa. So by mid 2014, they had done this so successfully that after taking over the city of Mosul, second largest city in Iraq, they were ready to declare a caliphate, which is what happened very prominently and was quickly followed by an appearance by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the declared caliph of the Islamic State. And so I think if there's one moment that really defines how the Islamic State did its business and why it was special, it was the appearance of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi at the An-Nuri Mosque in Mosul. And remember, this was a guy who had been in the shadows for years before. He had long pedigree as an insurgent in Iraq. And suddenly he shows up, and it's a very well-produced video. The speech is spoken openly in a very public place. And the Islamic State demonstrated right then and there that it was something different from Al-Qaeda. It had ambitions that were really world historical, and they were, unlike Al-Qaeda, they weren't scurrying around to do it. They were doing it in the open. And then since then, what we've seen is the rise and to a certain degree the fall of the Islamic State as it started lashing out outside of its borders, within its borders, at the edges of its borders in Iraq and Syria, and in some of its satellite areas. And then in 2019, it really reached what is a territorial low point. So at this point, it's been defeated enough in its territory that it doesn't hold any land any longer. It made a very big deal of the fact that it not only held land, but it was able to maintain its version of Islamic law there.
Yeah.
And now it's pretty much at the point where it's reduced again to an insurgency, and promising to come back, but we'll see about that.
Okay. And as you hinted, maybe towards the end, as the group started facing military defeats, they turned towards at least encouraging terrorism abroad, right?
Yeah, and they had done that from the beginning too. The way that they kind of phrased it to their followers was the first priority is get to the Islamic State. Come here, come to Syria, come to Iraq. And if you can't, then you attack at home. So there is this puzzle that I think a lot of analysts were trying to piece through, which is Al-Qaeda, in September 10th, 2001, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda had hundreds of people, but no more than hundreds. And then the Islamic State had tens of thousands of people who were traveling from overseas, let alone people who were sympathetic at home in the core territory in Syria and in Iraq. And so there was a question in people's minds: if you had 100 or 200 people who were able to conduct a September 11 style attack, why didn't you have many, many September 11 style attacks from these 40-odd thousand who were sympathetic? And the answer was because ISIS was saying, don't attack in Paris, don't attack in London. Only do that if you can't come to travel to fight and work on our behalf in Syria and Iraq. So there was always this directive, but for as long as it was possible for people to travel, I think a lot of people who would otherwise have been enthusiastic about conducting more attacks like the Bataclan were instead going and dying on the battlefields in Syria and Iraq. And then at some point, countries started to wise up. They got smarter about these things. They stopped letting their citizens travel as easily. The border became more difficult to pass through Turkey and Syria. And then we started to see a increase in the number of people who were willing to attack in foreign territory. And we're still in that phase. Luckily, maybe for us who are not in Iraq and Syria, a lot of the people who would have been attacking went there, and many of them have died.
Right.
So there's been a strange and ugly set of incentives that we've had in the West to keep tabs on people who might travel for these purposes.
Okay. So maybe we can turn towards the beliefs specifically. So we tend not to focus much, if at all, on current affairs or geopolitics on the podcast. So really, it would be nice to focus on the ideas, the beliefs. This is something we care about quite a bit, and how beliefs are formed, what they cause people to do. And on that theme, I've listened to countless hours of Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, for instance, talk about religion, including Islam. And they were drawing quite consistently a connection between some religious commandments and violence. And this is something that many people didn't like. And you got on my radar when you wrote this long piece in The Atlantic, what ISIS really wants, because this was clearly a contribution to that debate. You mentioned in the book at some point that there is this notion sometimes that ISIS arose out of nothing, that it came about extremely suddenly. But as you explain, it arose out of ideas which were sort of, well, in the air, or at least some people were adhering to these ideas. And so here I will quote you. So you write that in addition to the physical caliphate with its territory and war and economy to run, there was a caliphate of the imagination to which all these people had already emigrated long before they slipped across the Turkish border. They believed the state that awaited them would purify their lives by forbidding vice and promoting virtue. Its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, would unify the world's Muslims, restore their honor, and allow them to reside in the only truly just society. Its Muslim citizens would enjoy perfect equality, free of the iniquities that they had suffered due to differences of race, wealth, or nationality in the countries of their birth. Okay, so this is a very eloquent passage, I thought, and it really highlights the, your thesis, which is the importance of, the vision that all these people who were first at the core of the Islamic State had, and then that was shared by many people who joined from abroad, and also the people who couldn't do that but were dreaming of doing so.
Yes, and I think it's helpful to see some of the theories of how this process worked that disagree. First, I mean, there were a lot of people who were suggesting, oh, ISIS is because of the United States. ISIS is because of misgovernment in Iraq and Syria. ISIS is because of the Iraq War, and these were all very facile theories of the rise of ISIS, because, how does the Iraq War explain why someone who is comfortably living in Oslo decides to go to ISIS? How does poverty explain why someone who is, a qualified physician who is from Scotland decides to go to ISIS? There are so many ways in which each of these monocausal theories fails in the most obvious way. And so what I wanted to do from the start was to see, first of all, what the intellectual origins of this project were, and we can get to that, but also to see, all right, what is look, if we were to look at this like scientists, we're trying to figure out what variables need to be isolated that explain why this is happening. Then you'd want to find people who have gone to ISIS but don't have the background of having been oppressed by the government of Nouri al-Maliki. You'd want to find people who go to ISIS from different socioeconomic backgrounds, which is not at all difficult to find those people. And you find that they all have in common really just one thing, which is they were at some point infected with this idea that as you quote me saying, that there's one way to live as a Muslim, and that is as the subject of the Caliphate of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. And the more that I encountered the diversity of origins of these supporters, the more it was clear that no variable that mattered more. And so what we really needed to do was to find out everything we could about that variable. And it was, in fact, it was not something that was just invented in 2014. It was not some bright idea that Baghdadi had, but it was something that had existed as a version of Islam for almost as long as there has been Islam. And it was not something just conjured out of the desert, like something out of Aladdin's lamp that had inspired all these people, but something that was in some ways already there in the holy books and texts that they had already been reading.
Sure. So yeah, this we can push further in that direction. You remind the reader several times throughout the book that the people who are at the core and sort of around gravitating on the internet around ISIS tend to know Islam very well, for many of them at least. You're right. I mean, this is not a quote, but this is, I hope, a decent summary of you explain that they have a coherent and sensible, if fairly rare, understanding of Islam, and that they know and understand their religion better than most of their critics.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, there's plenty of people. The most common retort to this point is that, oh, there's all these morons who have gone to ISIS too, and that is certainly true. There are plenty of semi-literate fools who have gone to ISIS after knowing nothing about the history of their religion, except the very small things that ISIS had told them 24 hours before they left. But look, that's true of any group of people. There are some people who are extremely well educated intellectually, and then some people who are not. So I think what we need to see is that there is this long history in Islam, like in other religions, of trying to grapple with the differences between the context in which the religion was founded or revealed, if you prefer, and modernity. So there are many Muslims and many non-Muslims who see Islam in the modern form that many Muslims practice it. So Muslims today, there are millions and millions of Muslims who live in democracies, and so it seems strange to say that historically democracy has been an extremely aberrant practice in Muslim governance. But in fact, that's the case. I mean, democracy has been common on planet Earth for only 100 years or so. So it should not be too surprising that during the classical period of Islam, there was no support for the idea that there would be a plebiscite on major issues of governance. Yeah. So people were very surprised to and Muslims just as much as anybody else, to find that if you look at the classical texts about governance, if you look at the classical texts about leadership of the Muslim community, you find that they show every sign of their origins. They came from late antiquity and the medieval period. And if you were to take every Muslim who'd ever lived and then put them in a room together, the number of them who would think that liberal democracy is commanded by their faith would probably be very, 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 very small, and certainly not the majority. And most of them would have understood this concept of a caliphate, which of course goes back to the earliest generations of Muslims and is not democratic or liberal at all. It's a authoritarian state that exists for the propagation of a single religion at the expense of all others, and that exists for expansion, which is none of these things sits very comfortably in a modern liberal view of international relations.
So you mentioned that you discuss with various scholars of Islam, and well, they seem to you not very ready to agree with actually what you just explained. Many of them were not seeing, at least that's what they claim, not seeing the role of religion in these developments.
Yeah, there are some people, especially the loudest voices, who would say things like, "Oh, no, this has nothing to do with Islam. No, it's a complete misreading of Islamic history." And that view, I just after years of examining it, I found that it had very little merit. You could say that this is not the correct interpretation of Islam, and I don't have a view on that. I don't write as a Muslim. I don't write as a Christian. I'm writing as a journalist, and so it's not my point to say that what's the right way to be a Muslim. What I'm saying is, historically, Muslims have done many of the things that ISIS was doing, and that kind of switcheroo, saying, "Oh, what we really should be talking about is what's the right version of Islam, and ISIS is not doing the right version of it," is, I think, a way to evade my greater point, which is there is a history of Islam, and ISIS is part of it. Now, there were many, I thought, ingenious arguments that came up that explained why ISIS had things wrong, and I can go through some of those. It's true that even in Islamic history, the view that ISIS had was a minority view. I mean, ISIS even acknowledges that. They say most Muslims have been Sufis or from a different sect called Asharis that ISIS is vehemently opposed to. But ISIS would just say they're wrong, and the fact that we're a minority within Islamic history does not mean that we're wrong. So it was a really fascinating journey to talk to all of these enemies of ISIS and supporters of ISIS, and to see that the conversation between them is ongoing. There was an ongoing intellectual fight, and I think that fact alone just makes the point that this is not something that it's a matter of religion. It's not like you can answer the question. It's not finally going to be revealed to us unless, of course, God reveals it to us at the end of time, who was right about these things. And so it just goes on and on and on, these arguments. And unfortunately, we've had to live in the last few years through a rather bloody period in those arguments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, could we mention some of these arguments that people who are Muslims but who either agree or disagree with ISIS have had?
Yeah, so the arguments can be very seemingly minor, very particular, and they can be huge. But even the minor ones have, in the end, I think, major impact. So, in the category of the theological, ISIS has put forth a version of Salafi theological interpretation, Salafi theology. What is Salafism? It's the belief that the way to be a Muslim, it's a version of Sunni Islam, which says you need to emulate the first 2 or 3 generations of Muslims at the expense of all other things. So how do you find out what's right? You go to the people who knew Muhammad. You ask, you see what they did, and then you do it yourself. So theologically, among the things that has required is a very, very, or that it's entailed, is a very, very literal reading of text, where the most famous version of this, or famous instances of this, is that Muslims are in the Quran, they read that the phrase "the hand of God," which seems like an imputation of corporealness to God, which is a problem in a religion that says that God is abstract, that he has no body, and so on. So what most Muslims who have ever lived would say is that we should understand the hand of God to be metaphorical. It means the power of God. It means the authority of God. What Salafis have historically said is something else. They said, no. If it says the hand of God, it means the hand of God. You can't pretend that it doesn't say that. If it had meant the authority of God, it would have said the authority of God. So they say, well, that means God has a hand. It might not be like our hand, but God has a hand, and we have to deal with that, and maybe just show a bit of humility and say, well, I guess God has a hand. We just don't know what that means. So the way that this applies when it starts to get to theological and political questions both, is that there is in the Salafi mind, just as there is in theology, an inflexibility when it comes to forms of government that would be acceptable to a Muslim polity. So if you're willing to be flexible about the hand of God verse, you might be flexible about whether you can constitute a Muslim society on the basis of, say, democracy or constitutional monarchy. But if you are very particular about trying to emulate the way that the Prophet and his immediate successors ran their society, then no, there's just a lot less leeway. And you look at what they did. So what did they do? There was, of course, a major split between the Sunni and Shia, but we're talking about Sunnis here, not Shia in general. Mm-hmm. And they started a type of government called a caliphate. Now, a caliphate comes from the word khalifa is caliph, khilafa is a caliphate, and it comes from a three-letter Arabic root, khalafa, which coincidentally is the exact antonym of Salafa, which is where we get Salafi. Salafa means to succeed or come after, or excuse me, to come before, and then Khalafa means to succeed or come after. So a caliphate is, a caliph is someone who comes after and stands in for, depending on who you ask, the prophet or God or both. And it's one person. It is a unitary executive that who is human, who is not infallible, but commands the obedience and docility of Muslims, all Muslims. There can only be one at a time, theoretically. And this person is responsible for implementing God's law and bringing people closer to behavior that makes God happy. So that's how it was in the first few generations. Sunni Muslims do not dispute that. None of them do. They call the first few of them the righteously guided caliphs. Mm-hmm. And when ISIS came around, they said, yeah, exactly. That's exactly what we have to do. We have to replicate that model. And the way that ISIS saw it, there were a few caliphs who came after those rightly guided caliphs, up into including the Abbasid Empire, which is based in Baghdad and actually in Raqqa briefly. And they said, we need to do that again. And there's no leeway about this. If you want to say, oh no, Muslims can live under Queen Elizabeth, then no, you're wrong, and you're encouraging people to you're encouraging other Muslims to join you in hell by doing that. So ISIS, by saying there's only one way to live your life, was starting to get, of course, extremely intolerant, and the rest of their violence kind of flowed from that and was justified by it.
Yeah, it seems that it's very clear, actually, that it's consistent, actually, that once you accept this belief in this supreme authority, divine authority, which can send you to either heaven or hell, it seems to me quite consistent that you would, be obsessively dedicated to pursuing the former and avoiding the latter, and organizing your life around it, and even be led to see sort of ostensibly grotesque actions as helping others avoid hell or this type of thing.
Yes, and that's exactly what ISIS was doing. It was astonishing to me to see how developed their sensibilities were in this regard. These were people who were coming from countries not too different from my own. I'm Canadian and American, and I would be going to places like Australia and Norway and the UK and France that have at least generally a common patrimony. And they were coming from the same places, so they shared it too. It wasn't as if they had never heard of human rights. It was never as if they. It was not as if they had been told from birth that beheading someone is a fun and good thing to do. So ISIS had developed ways to habituate them to these awful things. And yeah, they really understood that what you have to do is just get people in for just the first few things that ISIS requests you to do. Get them to understand that, yeah, well, you have an obligation to follow the caliph. Well, if you believe that, then you can get them to believe anything. And sure enough, it was only a few short steps from there to getting them to accept the things that they, like us, had grown up being told were abhorrent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think this could be a nice transition to discussing converts, because I think, if I remember correctly, that they are overrepresented in the ranks of ISIS. Is this true?
Yes, that's quite right.
Okay.
Among foreign fighters, especially, the number of converts is greatly disproportionate. I mean, the numbers that we have are still iffy, but we're talking possibly in the order between 10% and the low end, maybe 15%. And then in some populations, I believe, for example, from Russia, it's around 1 in 5. So that does not represent the Muslim population worldwide. There's something about conversion that makes people more willing to accept this version.
Sure. It seems to be, well, at least one can understand it, or at least on an intuitive level, it makes sense, right? That people who start with very little knowledge of Islam and who are not, sort of thermalized into it as young people, as children, if you discover it all at once, it might be, you might be likelier to sort of accept it, entirely. And of course, there are different versions on the market, but one of the versions that has been marketed most aggressively is this one. And I guess before that, there was also, some. There was the campaign by Saudi Arabia to sort of propagate their own version, which is connected to that of ISIS. But yeah, please go ahead.
I think there's a few different reasons for this. One, as you alluded to, is if you've grown up with a religion as a child, you think of, what is my religion? My religion is, what my parents did. It's what my friends did. It's what my neighbors did. And you realize that these are all human beings, and they seem to live their lives in a pretty normal way, maybe with some exceptions. Some people pretty nice, and some people especially not nice. Whereas if you come to it as a convert, you don't have any of that long lifetime of experience, right, seeing the religion being practiced in maybe a hypocritical way, but in a non-crazy way. And instead, when you go and seek the sources of your religion, you might go into texts from antiquity, and you're going to have, I think, a lot of difficulty with piecing together how you reconcile those texts from antiquity with living in the modern world. And you'll notice that there are commands in most texts of Revelation, whether it be Judaism or Christianity or Islam, that are commanding you to do things that you can't do today, that that you shouldn't do. So it's very, very complicated psychologically for a convert to deal with this. There's also, and I was surprised to observe this, there's a condescension that converts receive. They'll, if you convert, maybe you're a really smart guy, you convert to Islam, you study Islam, and then you meet someone who's a 50-year-old a non-convert, native-born Muslim who's spent 50 years as a Muslim, and he kind of pats you on the head and says, "Oh, nice job," even though that person has never taken his faith seriously, knows much less about it than you. Right. And so there are some people who I think get a little insecure about this. They get annoyed at the condescension, and they want to show that they are more Muslim than you are. There's, as in many other religions, I think among a lot of native believers, a contempt for this kind of showing up late and then being extremely enthusiastic. And there's a phrase in Arabic where some of the, I forget which companion of the Prophet said, "Man dakhala fil ilm jumlatan kharaja minhu jumlatan," which means whoever got his religion or his knowledge all at once, he's going to lose it all at once. It's just a short-term thing, and don't take these people who were too enthusiastic for a short time at the beginning too seriously. And of course, that condescension, it's noted and it's responded to in pretty gross ways.
Okay. And I think since we've been discussing Canvas, it's a natural thing to also discuss the role of the internet in radicalization, as it's been called, and recruiting. And here you write that, in your opinion, the role of the internet has been overstated, that there tends to be, in almost all cases, some human contact on the ground in real life that these people who end up joining ISIS have.
Yeah, that's correct. There was a period when, ISIS was so active on the internet, so active recruiting, that it was assumed that the reason they get 40,000 people is they have a really good social media game. They're on Twitter a lot, and that is not the case. They were on social media a lot, and they were on Twitter a lot, and then they're on other platforms. But no, it seems to have required personal contact for almost everyone who went over there, and I think it's been overstated how powerful the motivation provided by social media alone has been.
Okay, I think we can talk about prophecy, the apocalypse, because this we haven't mentioned. And it really plays a huge part in the worldview of ISIS. There is this belief that, of course, the world will come to an end. This is something that was sort of, well, at least it's similar to the Christian belief in the apocalypse. These eschatological beliefs, as they are called. But before that, at least according to some some versions of Islam, a very specific sequence of events should take place before this happens. And to a large extent, what they have been doing is trying to sort of initiate this sequence, try to make some of the first events in this sequence happen. I should just let you describe it better than I can.
Yeah, it was something that really shocked me when I first heard it, because it was mentioned a lot in propaganda that ISIS had the end of the world in mind, and I grew up largely in the United States, where there's a lot of people who believe that the end of the world is coming within their own lifetimes. They're going to be Jesus. And they say that. I met very few people who actually acted as if they believed it. They were still saving for their retirement. They were, they weren't wandering the earth in sackcloth and ashes, trying to prepare for the imminent arrival of their Redeemer. Yeah. They were sinning and doing so. When I found people who invoked the eschatology of Islam and then seemed to be acting on it, or if they couldn't act on it themselves, credibly urging other people to, it was very, shocking and upsetting to me. So what does that eschatology look like? I mentioned before that the establishment of a caliphate was a big deal. One of the reasons it was a big deal was that there is a very famous prophecy that says there's going to be a period of caliphates, and then that's going to give way to a period of other types of rule, including a kind of harsh rule and tyranny. And then a caliphate will come back. And the period of harsh rule it sounds a lot like the authoritarian states that exist in the Muslim world for the last 50 years or so. And that's what ISIS claimed. They said that the caliphate had been extinguished before, and you could debate whether it was extinguished with the end of the Ottoman Caliphate in 1924 or the end of the Abbasids in 1258. But anyway, it was gone, and then it was replaced by a kind of idolatrous rule. And then when you bring back the caliphate, you initiate this sequence that ends with the end of time. The sequence continues where particular battles will happen at particular places, the most famous of which is a town called Dabik in northern Syria, where, in fact, battles did rage. And the name of the place gave its name to the chief propaganda magazine of ISIS, Dabik. And then there will be a fight between the Muslims and non-Muslims, and there will be battles over Constantinople. There will be a fight between Rome and the Islamic State, and there's debate over whether Rome is Italy or NATO or Russia or maybe even Turkey. And then when things get really bad, they get worse. The Antichrist will appear, the false Messiah called a Dajjal. And Dajjal will have magical properties. There will be famine throughout the world, but he'll have access to food and will just travel around the earth, getting followers by giving away. He'll perform magic acts, and the only way that he'll eventually be killed is after he's nearly wiped out ISIS, the Islamic State, Muslims. They'll be surrounded, nearly destroyed in Jerusalem. And then Jesus will show up. Jesus will come down from the heavens to Damascus, make his way to Jerusalem, join the Muslims, and then personally slay the Antichrist. And then there's going to be a period of rule by Jesus and this figure called the Mahdi, who will be a caliph, the caliph who's ruling at the time. And then that's not even the end, right there. There's a period of even greater suffering ahead after a period of righteous rule by these two guys. And then eventually the sun will rise in the west rather than the east. And that will be the last day. There will be no more repentance. And that will be the story of planet Earth.
Yes, it's quite a fascinating sort of story. And but yeah, what did ISIS take from it concerning what they should do in these past few years?
Yeah, so there's a few things that you might extract from this, lessons you might extract if you're a believer. One is that ISIS is doing what Muslims for generations, 1,000 years, have been told you have to do, which is follow the way of God. Follow the way of God, especially during the period when God's not being followed at all. So they take from that a confirmation that they're on the right track. They also notice, though, remember, part of that story is that the Antichrist is going to come and there will only be a few thousand Muslims left. If you believe that you're going to lose, you're almost going to lose, then you're maybe a bit more willing to accept temporary defeats along the way, which is exactly what's happened. I mean, ISIS has said, yeah, we lost the city of Mosul after taking it in 2014. It's gone again a couple of years later. We lost the city of Raqqa, and we lost the city of Baghouz finally. And this is to be expected. It's a test, and it's God's way of purifying the Muslims, seeing who sticks it out and who gives up. So if you're a true believer, this gives you resources that I think a normal person who sees the defeat and deaths of everyone around you might not have.
Okay. What did you call, this is something I think I understood, but it would be interesting for the audience to know why you called the book The Way of the Strangers.
Yes. Well, this was so the word strangers in Arabic, at least one version of it, is ghuraba. And what does it mean? There's a saying of the Prophet, an intriguing one to me, and one that ISIS invokes frequently. Mm-hmm. And the saying is, Islam began as a strange thing, and it will continue to be a strange thing. And so blessed be the strangers, the strange ones. And there's a number of interpretations one could have for this, but followers of the group really like to embrace this sense that they are foreigners, they're outsiders, they're not accepted. The beliefs that they have feel weird. And the weirdness of those beliefs is not an argument against them, they say. They say, we understand how barbaric we sound, how evil we sound. But, we were told in the beginning, the Muslims were told in the beginning that they sounded barbaric and evil. They were told that they were that they were bad people. We're ready to be told the same, and we'll understand it when we are. The other aspect of this is that there's strangers, not just in the strange, unexpected sense, but also in the foreign sense. What they're commanded to do is to travel from the countries that are their homes in the West, in the Arab world, and to go to Syria. And it might seem odd that you would go to impose your vision of the world on a place you've never been to, where you have no knowledge that anybody's going to welcome you. But that's, in fact, how Islam spread in the beginning. When the Prophet Muhammad, who was from the city of Mecca, was, as I mentioned, told that he needed to get out of there because he was upsetting too many of the Quraysh people who were running the place. He had to go as a stranger to the city of Medina, and he was welcomed there by the Medinans. But that meant that the first generation of Muslims all had the experience of having to be forced out of their home and to go to an unfamiliar place and kind of make do. Right. So all of this is very attractive, I think, to ISIS. First of all, the idea that we have to go somewhere that's not ours, that it will be difficult, and that the people who we know best, including maybe our former selves, will think we are abominable. So what I was trying to describe was the way of the strangers, the way that these people thought of themselves and how they acted and why.
Mm-hmm. Okay. My last question is to get back to the almost where we started, which was, we gave a quick summary of the history of ISIS. Maybe we can explore in some more detail, not too much, but just the current state of it. Of course, as you explained, you cannot really distinguish who is and who is not a member of ISIS, but maybe restricting ourselves to the people who are still there on the ground in the Levant, as they call it. Mm-hmm. What would be the size of the group at this point, and also are there still people migrating to this place in order to support the group from various countries?
So are there people migrating? No. We know that they're not not in large numbers. And one reason we know that is because ISIS told them not to. I think it was about 3 years ago, the directive was given, if you can get here, don't even try. Why? Because we envy you who are on the outside, who have so much that you could do for ISIS in your home countries. And if you came here, you would just be one more person who's going to die on the battlefield here. So the time for immigration has, at least temporarily in ISIS's view, ceased.
Okay.
Now, the question of how many people are still with ISIS is tough. It's tough for some of the reasons that we spoke of in the very beginning. What counts as someone who's fighting on ISIS's behalf? It's not like finding out who's in the U.S. Army because they're not wearing uniforms. They're not registered in quite the same way.
Sure.
So what we need to figure out, we might talk about how many people are on the ground in Iraq and Syria who are willing to fight, kill, vandalize on ISIS's behalf. I'm guessing that the answer to that question is in the thousands. It might not be in the tens of thousands, but there are still many, many people who, most of them, of course, Iraqis and Syrians, not the foreigners who've had a hard time surviving this long, who are ready to try to win back ISIS's territory. Remember, for the Iraqis and Syrians, they had other reasons for fighting other than ideology, because they were trying to, for example, keep safe their villages as a matter of Sunni identity and not trusting the Shia-dominated government of Baghdad. So they still have a fight to fight, and they have nowhere to go. Now, the more complicated and to me more worrying question is how many people still have ISIS on the brain in the rest of the world. And I think the answer to that is a lot. Why do I say that? Why would people not give away that, just pretend it never happened and stop being ISIS supporters? I think that a lot of people, when they see the way that ISIS was defeated territorially, they still haven't understood that, and I'm talking about outsiders, analysts, they still haven't understood that ISIS was something different. It was not just a territorial state. It was a state of mind. And when people observed ISIS's failures, if they were in that state of mind, they wouldn't say, "Oh, ISIS, they failed. They didn't win." First of all, they would think of things in a longer timeline. They might win in the longer run, but also they would notice that there was a set of beliefs that ISIS had that, to a certain extent, had been shared by previous generations of Muslims, including Al-Qaeda. And ISIS got further with those beliefs than anyone who has come before them in recent times. So the way that it might have looked to a supporter is not, let's try something else, but let's try more of that, because everything else has failed. And just give us a little time, and the next round will be a resurgence with a vengeance.
Okay, so it's good to keep that in mind. So I've reached the end of my questions. Do you think I've failed to nudge you towards something important that we should discuss before we end it?
No, I've had a great time, and I've really enjoyed the questions. So if you have anything else, I'm happy to talk about it. But this has been a great conversation.
Okay, well, thank you for coming on the podcast. And yes, I also had lots of fun. Yes, I can recommend your book. And yes, thanks again, Graeme.
Thank you so much.
Have a nice day.
My pleasure. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Liberté Académique. We are a science, critical thinking, and freedom podcast. We interview researchers, teachers, and authors who have interesting ideas and who defend free, rational, evidence-based thought. We oppose as best we can a sort of anti-intellectualism coming from a section of the intellectual class. We carry out interviews in English and in French. You can find all our episodes on YouTube and on SoundCloud, as well as on the main podcasting platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, and several others. We are also present on Twitter @AcadFreedom and also on Facebook.